3P&R with Adam R. Welcome to 3P&R. I'm your host, Adam R. And joining me for this episode is Jeff Morley. Jeff, how you doing, sir?
I'm good, Adam. Good to be here.
Good. I'm glad to have your time. I appreciate it. Let's open up with this. Let's tell people who you are, what you do, and what got you to where you are.
So my name is Jeff Morley. Jefferson Morley is my byline, and I'm a writer, editor, investigative reporter in Washington, D.C. I have been a reporter in Washington for about getting close to 40 years now, 35 years. Worked on a variety of national publications ranging from The Nation, The New Republic, to The Washington Post, where I spent the longest time, 15 years as an editor and reporter. I've also written 4 books, 3 of them about the CIA. And as my career went on, the CIA became the focus of my work. The 3 books are Our Man in Mexico, which is the story of the CIA's top man in Mexico in the 1960s. That was published in 2008. Then The Ghost, the story of James Jesus Angleton, the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA. That was published in 2017. And just a year ago, less than a year ago, 2022, I published Scorpion's Dance, which is the story of CIA Director Richard Helms and his very complex relationship with President Richard Nixon. So over the years, as I've moved from, daily news reporting and all sorts of things, I came to focus on the CIA. And I wanted to really understand how the organization worked, because I could see in my journalism how important it was, and also how little people knew about it, even very well-informed people in Washington. So when I was coming up as a reporter and editor, I made it a point to educate myself about the CIA. And I did that by reading a lot of books, but also by talking to people. There's no substitute for that if you want to really understand a subject. And so I started interviewing retired CIA people and asking them about declassified documents that had recently come into the record. And that was how I gained the expertise and how I came to write those 3 books. Along the way, being interested in the CIA, I became interested in the assassination of President Kennedy, a story in which the CIA figures in many ways. So I began to educate myself about that. And I was fortunate to be coming up in the 1990s when a huge amount of new material about the Kennedy assassination came into public view in the 1990s. It was not until then that most of the government's records on the subject were declassified. And I started going to the National Archives with friends actually who knew more about the intelligence business than I did. And we began to look at those records and looking not for, who killed JFK. I mean, that's a very interesting question, but, or whose theory or whatever, but like what was new, what hadn't been understood before. And because there was so much material, I was really quite confident that there would be significant new stories about the events that led to the assassination of President Kennedy in November 1963. So that led to the creation of my blog, JFK Facts, in 2012, which is now available on Substack, jfkfacts.substack.com. It's a subscription newsletter, all things JFK. If you want to keep up with what I'm talking about here in this podcast, you should subscribe or at least take a look at it regularly. So JFK Facts, the blog, was really an effort to put out what I had learned about the assassination. And also, there was a lot of bad journalism about JFK's assassination. I mean, there was a lot of stupid conspiracy theories, and people complained a lot about that. And that was true. That is true. But there's also a lot of bad journalism, and often in the service of anti-conspiratorial politics. So JFK Facts was, an effort to set the record straight. So that is how I came to start that venture, and that's not a full-time job, but it's a significant job to stay current on events, and a lot's been happening around JFK records in the past year. So we can talk about that later. I'll just add one more thing. I also started a website called Deep States, which is about the world's intelligence agencies. And my interest in the CIA spread to, well, this is how our clandestine service works. You know, how does the Russians' clandestine service work? How do the Brits work? How do the Israelis work? And so Deep States, deepstate.org, deepstateblog.org is a place where I've kind of compiled a lot of research. It's not as news oriented, although it has recent stories, but it has a guide to the world intelligence agencies, which I think people will find very interesting. So intelligence agencies are my thing, CIA in particular, and JFK's assassination in even more particular. So that's where I'm coming from, Adam.
I find it very interesting. I think it's important that someone does that. One, people need to be educated on there's this illusion of what the agencies are, right? And a lot of it has to do with Hollywood and TV.
Yes.
Even when I ask people in life, I'm like, well, when you hear CIA, what do you think of? And automatically they result to these people that are in foreign countries and are like Jason Bourne. There's more to it than that. And
the James Bond, Jason Bourne, that is how people understand the world of secret intelligence in a lot of ways. There's been other popular entertainments which are better, like the show Homeland was somewhat, more realistic. But this Hollywood conception of what the CIA does and what it obscures or what it distorts is, a central intelligence agency has a task, and that is, not surprisingly, centralizing intelligence. So what the CIA does is it seeks to capture information in the space that is of interest to the president, basically, and the government. And it captures it all and it brings it into one place and it tries to synthesize it so that it can perform tasks or give advice to the president. I mean, the CIA doesn't have any power unless the president listens to them. So the CIA is like this mammoth university attached to, a paramilitary forces that is at the disposal of the president. So that's a kind of scientific description of it. You might think that that's terrible. You might think that they're good guys and are helping us. Whatever it is, that is kind of how it works. And so that's very different than the, hopping on planes and ripping off disguises. I mean, all of which the CIA does. But what the CIA does mainly is collect intelligence and analyze it. Right.
And that the problem is with the American people, it's, conspiracy, mystery, it's the American vernacular and it's appealing. And I understand it, but what people don't realize, and I say this a lot, I do a lot of research on ufology and paranormal in the show. And I learned one thing, and I actually not even learned, I knew it. There must be secrecy because we have adversaries. And if you were fully transparent, we would have no defense to anything.
Right. So Dick Helms, the CIA director who I profile in my latest book, Scorpion's Dance, said, either you have a clandestine service or you don't. And if you do have one in a democracy, that's a compromise, right? Because it's not going to be transparent like you want in a democracy, right?
Right.
It can't be the same as another governmental function. So this paradox of a secret service in a democracy, that's a constant tension. It's a real contradiction. It's a real tension, and we see it playing out in the headlines today especially about these classified document controversies that are embroiling Trump and Biden. It's all about the secret information that is gathered by the government and held secretly, and so we have a big secret apparatus in this country, 17 intelligence agencies within the federal government. If you look at those intelligence agencies and combine all of their budgets, it's probably $60 to $80 billion a year. And that's in a federal budget of $700 billion. I mean, a defense budget of 700 billion. So, it's 15% or, more of defense spending is the intelligence sector. So it's a big, powerful sector in the American government, just by, dollar figures alone. And, I mean, like, there's a National Geospatial Agency, NGA, an agency that most people, I would say 99% of Americans, have never heard of.
I'm unfamiliar with that, actually. I had to write that down.
Yeah. NGA, National Geospatial Agency. They have a $5 billion a year budget. That's a big agency, and it's virtually unknown. What they do is they analyze satellite photography to, be able to measure things on the ground, military bases, that sort of thing. But, a huge intelligence function. But anyway, the intelligence community, their budgets are entirely secret, right? So maybe some members of Congress can see them, but you don't have the transparency that you have on other agencies, even the Pentagon. Right? At the Pentagon, you want to know what the Army's spending, you could probably go and find out, and it's on the public record, or your congressman can.
Right.
These intelligence agencies, forget it. They might not be able to get that unless they're the chairman or, a ranking member on a committee. So their workings are very obscure. So when I kind of got a picture of that, how important the intelligence agencies were, and CIA among them, I wanted to really, kind of study them and learn more about them and spend time thinking about them. So that's, where I went with my professional interest.
Now, do you find in the research you've done that they compartmentalize? They don't really share information?
Yeah, I mean, the compartmentalization of information is always a problem in a secret bureaucracy because they only exist to keep secrets. But then you're keeping secrets from, yourself, basically.
Right.
And, and what we saw in the Watergate period in the 1970s, right, when I was sort of coming of age, was, all of a sudden the workings of the CIA were laid bare for the American people, who really were very innocent at that time and couldn't believe that, our people were doing these dirty tricks, assassinating people, bribing people, putting LSD in their, drinks. And so there was this shock, and the CIA was really curbed for the first time in the 1970s. And there was real, opposition to them and hostility even to them in the political system.
It's even alleged that they had a program involving Charles Manson. And I'm still on the fence to figure out whether that's true or not.
Yeah, that's the story that is put out by this book called Chaos. And, I was not convinced by that book. I mean, Charles Manson was in a milieu, yes, what you might say, community would be too strong a word. He was in a milieu where the doctors who he had some contact with had some contact with the CIA program known as MK Ultra, which was an effort to use drugs to control people's minds and behavior that was funded for a long time by the CIA. A very notorious program. But that book, I mean, did not convince me that Manson had any real substantive, functional connection with the MK Ultra program.
Right. I mean, at best, he was a narc. And I say this only because when you look at his arrest record, it's outrageous. How did this guy keep getting out of jail? And the only thing that came to my mind is he's a narc. Because typically in the CIA, your job and your function, if you're not just a test subject, your function is don't be seen, don't be caught. I mean, that's right. If I had to imagine anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and it was never very clear in that book what the author was alleging. What did Manson have some functional role? Was he a victim of MK Ultra? Was he dosed with LSD? There was a lot of heavy breathing in that book, but I did not find it satisfying. And knowing both Jim Angleton and Dick Helms, the subject of my two books, both had significant roles in MK Ultra. So I was very familiar with, the granular history of that program and how it happened and how it was exposed. So But the point being, whatever the case with Manson, MK Ultra was a crime. It was a crime spree. The way that people were unwittingly dosed with LSD was criminal.
Right.
And the agency buried it when it was about to come to light. Dick Helms, in fact, himself shredded the key records, and so we never had really learned the full extent of it. But when you look at kind of conspiratorial thinking, the MK Ultra story is, that's the kind of thing that makes people go around the bend,
Right.
because it is an amazing story, and a terrible thing. So
let's rewind time. Let's go back to prior to JFK assassination. And you got, the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the Secret Service. In my opinion, from everything I've read, still in their infancy, right? Not really. No one's really firm on who has what control, or maybe they did.
Yeah.
There's no literature speaking to it. So the JFK, and I think people don't understand is what he was involved with. And at the time, it's the Cold War. Cuba had weapons from Russia on board with the blockade, the Bay of Pigs, where JFK, and not even JFK. I hear this in these shows a lot. Like, oh, JFK removed their air support. He's the president, but there is a committee of people that decided that, not one individual. So they hung a lot around the guy's neck. So ultimately, he was involved with a lot of controversial decision making, right?
JFK was quite controversial in his time, and reviled by the political right as both a weakling and a traitor. The rhetoric that was directed at JFK, I would say, was even harsher than directed at Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. It was very, on the political right, there was real, genuine hostility, hatred of JFK.
It's despicable too, because at the end of the day, the way he's thinking is idealistic. It's formed for, we the people. He wanted really the best for the country, and I think he came in recognizing there's I don't want to use the word corruption, but there was a lot of misleading statements leading to wars, and even our president prior talked about the military-industrial complex, and I think JFK took note and started examining that, and same with RFK. They were examining this. Is this a threat? Are they a separate entity?
Definitely. No. And in the memoirs of the period, several people note that JFK talked about this, and he talked about the influence of generals in the American government in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which happened in October 1962. Just describe the situation because it illustrates exactly what you're talking about, Adam. So Cuba had become had overthrown an American dictatorship, and Fidel Castro, a leftist, a communist, had taken power there, and thrown out the pro-American government and organized crime, which had dominated Havana. And so Castro became this big communist, and he was very defiant about the United States. Yankee, go home. So the U.S. government, first under President Eisenhower and then under President Kennedy, under the leadership of the CIA, were determined to assassinate and overthrow his government. And so in 1962, what Castro did was he agreed with the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union could put nuclear missiles in Cuba, and that would deter the United States from invading and overthrowing his government. It was a way of the Soviet Union, the big communist country, would protect Cuba, the new little communist country. So they install the missiles secretly. Well, the U.S. discovers this from reconnaissance photographs overhead, and President Kennedy makes this public. He feels betrayed by the Russians, and he goes on TV and he says, "Look, you have to remove those missiles, or we're going to destroy them." And he puts up a naval quarantine around Cuba, and he says, to the Soviet leadership, "You have to get rid of these missiles, or else we're going to have war." This was the moment when the world came the closest to nuclear war that we have ever been. This was a very scary situation because both countries were on a hair trigger. If any nuclear weapons were fired, hundreds of nuclear weapons would be fired.
Right, and it's devastation for the planet 15-fold. I mean, people don't realize that either.
Yeah.
We were at our stations. We were ready.
Yeah. So Kennedy was in a very dicey situation, and his generals were saying, don't do this diplomacy. Don't give an ultimatum. Just attack and destroy the missiles right now. Just invade and get it over with. And there's not going to be any nuclear war. And Kennedy wouldn't do that. And so the generals reviled Kennedy for this. And eventually, the Soviet Union came in and agreed. Kennedy said, I'm not going to invade Cuba. And the Soviet Union said, okay, we don't, then the missiles aren't necessary. We'll take them out. And so the whole thing was resolved peacefully. This was a terrifying moment for the world. And it was a spectacular political triumph for Kennedy. People talk about the 2022 midterms and how Biden did unexpectedly well. Usually the opposition party, does very well in a midterm election against an incumbent president.
Right.
In that year, because Kennedy had just settled the Cuban Missile Crisis like a week before Election Day, like the Democrats did great. I mean, they might have lost like 2 seats in the Congress, and they thought they were going to lose 20. And so Kennedy also shoots up in popularity. And so Kennedy realizes that, hey, peace is good politics, right? Not only did I avoid a war, but hey, I'm riding high now. He really he became the favorite for re-election after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that was in the general population. In the national security community, among the generals in the CIA, they thought Kennedy's solution was terrible. And they thought he should have attacked and he should have gotten rid of Castro. And here now Castro is still in there, and that was intolerable to people. And so there was bitter resentment of Kennedy after the Cuban Missile Crisis, after late 1962. And that continued all through 1963. Kennedy's politically popular with the general public, but he's very unpopular with his military and intelligence people.
It's a bizarre state of mind, because these generals want to show a force to put in an authority figure, let them know we're the superpower. But the threat from Castro outside of Russian weaponry was really no threat. And there was this
not at all. I mean, and that's why Eisenhower didn't care about Cuba, and Kennedy didn't care either. Strategically, right? Here you are, you're a nuclear power, you're facing another nuclear power there. Cuba, I mean, it's inconsequential. It's of no economic or military significance whatsoever. Eisenhower and Kennedy wanted to focus on the enemy, on Europe. That's where the confrontation was very tense. Cuba was less than a sideshow. But in domestic politics, it had this huge, profile.
Yeah, and another thing, too, I hear people say this a lot, and I can't stand when they say it. They're like, oh, well, the mafia was working with Cuba. That's not the case at all. Castro got rid of the mafia. He actually destroyed their plans out there. There was no real relationship there. I mean, in Castro's eyes, they're still American. You got to go.
No, he threw them all out. He threw them all out.
So the mob at the end of the day had incentive to actually go after Castro rather than JFK, in my opinion.
Well, the CIA enlisted organized crime figures who had been powerful in Havana to assassinate Castro.
Huh. See, I mean, I did read that, and I find that to be a little bit more appealing than the idea of these mob figures, and they're sitting there with Castro plotting JFK's demise. The mafia had their own particular reason to have a dislike for JFK/RFK, because, and people call the Kennedy family, they're contradictory. Their father used to do whatever, and I'm not even going to speak to it. The point is, everyone on Earth, every human being, we're one person, and then we allow logic to prevail. We grow up and view things in hindsight, and we evolve and become either better people or worse. The Kennedy family became better.
Yeah. Well, yes, and Kennedy was a different president in 1963 than he had been in 1961. And I believe that this was unacceptable to certain factions in his own government, and that the culmination of that was the assassination.
So let's look at this before we even get to the Oswald part. Who has more motivation to remove Kennedy? And it's starting to sound a lot like military figureheads. Like, I mean, I don't want to say that, it was completely domestic because there was other factors there. But when you think of the motivation, like there's this whole thing about Oswald that I didn't know. I don't know how many people knew it or not, but he's traveled to Russia. He's traveled to Mexico. He knew a lot of languages. He spoke a lot of languages. Everything about him.
No, he didn't speak a lot of languages. He spoke English and Russian.
He didn't speak Spanish. Oh no, he had a translation. He had a Spanish book of translation. That's right.
He expressed some interest at some point in learning Spanish at a couple of different points, but I don't think he ever did. I don't think he could speak Spanish. But I mean, I think the important thing is, I mean, we can speculate about who had the motivation and all of that. I think the important thing is to look at the record of what we know actually happened, not
right.
things that we need to speculate about, but established fact.
Agreed.
And the established fact is that, you know, the government came out with this story that one man alone killed the president for no reason. And then another guy came along and killed that guy because he felt like it. Okay, that was the story that the government told in the first official investigation, what was called the Warren Commission report. Okay. Now, since that report came out in 1964, 60 years ago, we've had, you know, a huge amount of new information. And the government's story was never particularly credible, and it's gotten less credible with the passage of time, which brings us to the current day, which is, you know, the government is still concealing JFK records. So this is an unfinished story. And I think that it's all well and good to talk about, you know, this theory and that theory and all that, but there's also an emerging factual story. We don't need to talk about theories. We can talk about what actually happened, what we're learning. So that's where we're at, you know, 60 years later.
So moving into it, so sticking to facts, right?
Yeah.
In your opinion, or it's actually, I don't know, it's tough for me because when I watch these, unfortunately, I watch a lot of shows and documentaries, and then I combine it with things I read from, you know, what you pull from the historical record.
Right.
It's very viable that Oswald was a lone shooter and that these multiple gunshots people were hearing were echoes. Because if you look at Dealey Plaza, there's a lot of large, hard surfaces where the sound wave could echo multiple, amongst the tunnel too. So it could be very well that he was a lone shooter. And then you look at where
okay. I mean, look, that's the official story, so we have to take it very seriously. And in some ways, it's the clearest, simplest story. So all of that. Now, there were a couple of hundred people in Dealey Plaza when the gunfire that killed Kennedy erupted. And those people were canvassed by investigators, by the Warren Commission, by researchers later. And there were at least 50 people, including 20 law enforcement officers, who thought that gunfire came from both behind and in front of the president's motorcade from two different directions, meaning that there was some kind of conspiracy. So, you know, the notion that, now you're right? Ear witness testimony in a place with buildings and all that, anybody who's familiar with, you know, gunfire forensics and eyewitness testimony and all that will tell you it's very unreliable. People, you know, hear and see who knows what. But I think that there's a big body of evidence that indicates the president was hit by gunfire from two different directions. So yes, analytically, I keep the possibility open, and compare other scenarios or other analysis to the official story. But I do think that the evidence that has emerged in recent years, and this is evidence that people may be less familiar with, tends to undermine the official story and point to a different explanation.
Agreed. You know, there's another big thing too. When you evaluate and learn about the behaviors of Oswald, which is not stable, given he had a lot of impulsive decisions he made, he seemed he had a lot of chemical responses that were abnormal. So he would be the perfect patsy in a sense, because he did say, I'm just a patsy here. And he said it very clearly And, you know, when you've seen him speak, you know, when someone's guilty of something that's so traumatic and they're trying to defend themselves, the chemicals in their body are raised, so they're speaking a little bit more of a higher octave. I think he did have involvement. He just didn't realize the level of involvement they're pinning upon him, right?
Yeah. No, and that's a very good point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it is too rarely noted, right? People say Oswald, the accused assassin, and I always try to say the accused assassin who denied killing Kennedy, right? I mean, he said he didn't do it, and then he was killed, right? So I think that he probably was what he said he was. Why would you say you were a patsy, you know, unless you were, right? That's a very strange thing to say if you've just, you know, shot and killed the president for some, you know, personal reason. Why would you turn around and say, I didn't do it?
Yeah,
you know?
Because they did tie this guy to having known people from Cuban resistance. They did tie him to speaking with KGB. However, the KGB denied his visa, and they denied even entertaining his ideas. This guy's a perfect patsy because he's doing everything right to catch the right attention from the be such.
Yeah. So,
you know, here's another thing too, and I don't know what you know about it or what you believe about it, but I found it odd. The rifle they collected from the actual scene versus a rifle that the one of the law enforcement propped above his head. I would never have noticed this, but they pointed this out on a documentary that the rifle stock and where the strap connects is two different locations versus the one in the picture with him versus the one they're holding up. And I had to scrutinize those pictures a lot because you know, they weren't of the best quality, but I did notice a slight difference. And now maybe is it because of the way they took the picture?
Yeah, I mean, some officers identified it as a Mauser, not as a Mannlicher Carcano.
Right.
So just to kind of step back from that is one piece of many pieces of disputed forensic evidence in the case, right? One of the problems with understanding the assassination is, like, almost every fact is contested by different people, and we don't have a body of evidence that everybody agrees on. But I think that there are too many forensic anomalies to be that are not explained by the lone gunman theory. It doesn't make sense. But I would say this, over the years, somebody told me this the other day, and I thought it was very interesting. Over the years, different bar associations and law schools have sponsored mock trials of Lee Harvey Oswald. And what they've done is they've created a prosecution team and a defense team, and they take all the evidence that, you know, was available at the time, and then they argue it, and they have a jury of people who, you know, and then the jury votes. So in 7 mock trials in the past 30 years or so, 6 of them have ended with acquittal or with acquittal of Oswald or a hung jury. Only one of the 7 resulted in a conviction, which I think that's a pretty good measure of the body of evidence. I mean, these were serious, you know, when a law school puts something like this together, you know, they work really hard to get it right. And, you know, and some of these had, you know, former prosecutors who handled the case. So a very high level of professionalism in analyzing the evidence. And, you know, for the most part, people said, no, it doesn't hang together. This guy couldn't have done, you know, it's not beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, I was going to say the key phrase there is reasonable doubt.
Right.
And that's pretty substantial to hear that.
Yeah. So, you know, then that brings you into the whole realm of, well, you know, what's your theory? Who killed JFK? Mafia did it. CIA did it. You know, so Adam, you know, I've been writing about this for 30 years and I don't have a theory. Okay. Right. If you want to talk JFK theories, buy me a drink. We'll go across the street to the bar, buy me 2 drinks, and I'll start giving you theories. When I'm talking to you, when I'm like writing, I don't deal with theories. It's a waste of time.
I agree with you. Yeah, because what ends up happening, you go down a rabbit hole with no tangible evidence at the end of the road.
Right. So And that's a hard thing because, people go online, they try and educate themselves and they see this theory and that theory. And, there's compelling things. And then people say, well, what about Oliver Stone's JFK? And I'll say this about Oliver Stone's JFK. His script for that movie is based very, very much on the public record. There's not a lot that's been invented there. Now, there is some, because it's a Hollywood picture. It's it's not a documentary. Characters are combined and certain incidents are simplified or over dramatized. But there's a lot of evidence to support the depiction of the crime in JFK, which is that Kennedy was killed by, high-level enemies in his own government who were opposed to his policies. So, it's a very important question. That's why people still care about it. It's like, well, what really did happen? It really tells us, something about our country. So that's why it's still an issue. That's why people still care about it. That's why it still matters, even though it happened a long time ago.
Yeah, because he was a great president, in my opinion. I around my neck right now, I have a Kennedy $50. I admire him.
Well, the thing that I think we see about Kennedy, where he was very, prophetic or a visionary after the missile crisis, imagine you're the guy who would have had to make the call and where 30 million people would die.
Yeah.
Kennedy, he was, as a man, he was scared and he had every reason to be. And, he was outnumbered. He was, the generals were pissed. And even the majority of his advisors were saying, attack now, attack now. And Kennedy was hanging back, fearing, nuclear war. And after that, in 1963, he gives a speech at American University in Washington, D.C., and he talks about a strategy for peace. And he says, the Russian people, they're just like us. Yeah, we hate their system, but, we don't want to kill them. They're just like us, he negotiates the first nuclear arms control treaty, the limited test ban treaty. And he was really trying to wind down the Cold War in a way that really wasn't, had never been tried before. And that was kind of cut short because when he was killed, President Johnson came in and he was much more sympathetic to the generals, and U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy became much more militaristic. We escalated in Vietnam instead of withdrawing like Kennedy planned to do. So it was a pivotal moment where we became a more militaristic society, and these intelligence agencies gained a degree of impunity that they never lost, really.
Yeah, not to mention his brother was strongly looking at the FBI as well. He had an agenda where he was scrutinizing, their leadership, what they do, what they could disclose.
Right. And J. Edgar Hoover, the longtime director of the FBI, hated John and Bobby Kennedy, hated them, and was perfectly happy when JFK was killed. That didn't bother J. Edgar Hoover a bit. He was very glad Lyndon Johnson, the new president, was his friend and neighbor. So the assassination did not bother Kennedy's enemies in his own government.
It's a shame because, when Kennedy did this speech speaking about us going to the moon, it had as a kid, when I first watched that, because I'm a lover of space and technology and learning. I love that. That's my passion of it. But when you hear him speak, it had such a profound effect on me. And I'm talking years and years long after him. And I'm a young man and I'm watching this film footage from him, and it inspired me. And I instantly had a great connection with this Kennedy figure. And the unfortunate part for Kennedy is him and his brother, they had so many enemies. And I think that's the allure to this story, because it is a bit of mystery. And for me, if I wanted to deal with Kennedy, and I found this guy Oswald and the way he behaves and the ideology he falls under, and he's perfect to manipulate, to put in position so you could have a trained operative handle the actual job. That he is the ideal candidate to put there for patsy purpose. Ideal.
A guy who worked in CIA operations for about 15 years called me up after he read my books, and he said, he said, I'm not talking out of any inside information. I'm just going to talk about about tradecraft. And he said, in Our Man in Mexico in particular, I describe how Oswald comes to the attention of the CIA before the assassination and all the intrigue that is involved in that. And he said, Oswald is what we call an agent of influence. He's not a source, right? He's not an informant. He's not a guy who's giving you a particular piece of information from inside a politician's office or a bedroom or something like that. But he's somebody who will do favors for you and, can help you out, run this across the street, take this over there, that type of thing.
Right.
He said the way you describe Oswald's relationship with the CIA, he was an agent of influence, and people were, working with him, getting him to do things.
Yeah, there's this show.
Yeah, so in that regard, he's he is the perfect patsy.
Yeah, and I watched his show where they discussed him in Mexico, and he had on his persons, he had the English to Spanish book, the 4 postcards, and it sounds Oswald was a very smart guy. I mean, the whole myth of the lone gunman, a lunatic, a fanatic, is not the case at all. He was a smart, self-taught guy. Never went to high school, but spoke very good Russian. People who were native Russian speakers were impressed that he'd spent a couple of years in the Soviet Union and spoke Russian well. He was smart. He was, he wasn't an isolated sociopath. In Russia, he had girlfriends. He married a woman. They had kids, he fought with his wife, but that's nothing new. He was not this strange character. He was an adventurer. He was a schemer. He was an opportunist, and he was a tough guy. He'd been a Marine. Right.
He carried guns. He was a tough guy. So a complex, interesting figure, but somebody who was manipulated, probably.
So that book you have, The Man in Mexico, talk a little bit, because I have to now. So to know, I like talking to my guests. I like to know very little about them to have what I call a coffee meeting, right? I just met you around a coffee, and now I got to get these books. I have to.
Yeah. So Our Man in Mexico was published by the University Press of Kansas, and you can buy it on their website. And it's the story of Winston Scott, who was the chief of the CIA's Mexico City station from 1956 to 1969. So he was in charge of the surveillance operations that pick up Oswald before the assassination. And then in many other things, he was a very powerful man. He was very good friends with the various presidents of Mexico, the head of the Mexican FBI, U.S. ambassador. So he was a guy who wielded a lot of power in Mexico for a long time. So his story is fascinating around the JFK story, but the larger story of, how a CIA station operates, this guy, very accomplished spy, really was one of the most highly regarded officers in the CIA. So his story is very interesting, and he was an interesting man. He was married 3 times. He wrote poetry. He was a very interesting character, and he had a front row seat on the surveillance of Oswald and the investigation of Kennedy's assassination. So a very interesting person to write about. And, his story, which I tell in Our Man in Mexico, is just a great spy story. So I highly recommend it. I am biased since I wrote the book, but
as you should
definitely enjoy it.
Yeah, I actually want to read that. That's what I love doing that. So again, I knew you were an author, I knew you were a journalist, but I said, I do this a lot. I don't want to invite someone to the show and learn everything about them, because then, it takes away from it being genuine on the conversation and then learning about it. Because right now, I really want to read these books badly, and then more than likely I'll have you back on again to discuss those. So,
yeah. So,
let me ask you this. I'm going to ask your opinion on this, because I don't know how or why I got involved with reading about it. Someone sent me a link some time ago because they knew I was interested in JFK, and I was, I haven't spoke about it on a podcast yet. I wanted to, as you said, stick to the facts. And they presented this documentary where it's linking the ties between JFK, RFK and MLK. And I watched that doc, and by the end of it, I was more confused than I was educated. Like, I just didn't see the links. Is there something there that I'm missing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very tricky subject, and it is striking that four major, liberal figures who were, who had enemies in the U.S. government were killed in a short period of time. Linking all of those assassinations to one group of people, I mean, it's a bridge too far. There's real questions about all of them, and I think that's the way to understand them as discrete events. I've never specialized or delved deeply into Robert Kennedy's assassination. I have friends who have and who believe that there was a conspiracy there. I don't know enough to offer a really informed opinion.
Right. Yeah, because the only real connection I see to the three of them were this strong dislike from the FBI, and even that is not enough, because the guy that shot RFK, it almost appears to me like the same guy that shot at Ronald Reagan. His influence was something, some form of psychosis. Outside of that, I really don't see it. I don't see the connection between the three.
Yeah.
So it's bizarre.
So, yeah, I mean, I feel like I can't offer an informed opinion.
No, as you shouldn't, because again, there's not a lot of facts there. It's unfortunately, again, with humans, because we love mystery, we love let's be honest, if we were to find out the actual facts behind anything mysterious, our interest in it would almost fade, because it's no longer a mystery to us. It's not appealing. We know the answer. So I'll ask you then, and then I guess we'll form it this way. From start to finish, kind of run through what you think took place with JFK from before to right up to the assassination, in your opinion. Like a chronological order, how you see it, like how you have it in the JFK facts, something like that. How would you form it?
Let me see if I can summarize it quickly. As by late 1963, this itinerant character, Lee Harvey Oswald, is of specific determined interest of senior CIA officers who
as they're looking to influence him, because he's as intelligent as he might have been, and he's a former Marine, and he's still subject to influence. I mean, it's pretty clear.
Yeah. If you see his behavior on the day of the assassination, he clearly has some knowledge, because after the president is killed, he leaves the office building overlooking the motorcade where Kennedy had just passed by. He goes home and gets a gun. And so, why would you go get a gun?
Right.
He didn't come to work with it. Something happened, and that something was the assassination. Then he denies that he's involved, and then he's killed. I mean, the president's enemies had arranged, I think, two operations, that kind of dovetailed. One was the kinetic operation, to lay down the gunfire that would kill the president. And the other was a psychological warfare operation, or a deception operation, to blame the crime on Cuba. And that's where Oswald came in as the patsy. He was the pro-Cuba guy who had done this. And somehow Oswald had been lured into this scenario with some type of knowledge. Was he firing the gun? It's possible he was firing a gun that day. There's the evidence that he was. There's no direct evidence that he was. Nobody saw him doing that. So, but it's possible. He was on the scene. He was in the building. He had owned a gun that was found on the 6th floor of that building. So, and he seems to have had some guilty knowledge. And to say you're the patsy, I mean, that's almost that implies that you have guilty knowledge, right?
Right.
That somehow you're a plausible suspect for something you didn't do. Um, so so there's, those two operations come off, and the president's dead, and there's going to be blamed on Cuba. But the problem for the people who orchestrated this was that Oswald was arrested alive. A Dallas police officer tries to arrest Oswald. Oswald pulls that pistol that he just went and got, and he kills the policeman. And then he's arrested a short time later. Killing the policeman, I think, also, it's also unexplained. But the point being that then Oswald has some knowledge and is going to go on trial for killing the president. And that was a very scary thing for people high up in the CIA, because Oswald on trial, talking about going to the Soviet Union and coming back and all of that, everything, every step of the way, he had been watched by senior CIA officers. So his trial, it would have been very difficult for the government to keep that out of the trial. And Oswald wasn't stupid. He was able to defend himself in political, arguments. And so Oswald on trial was a very dangerous prospect. And I think that the people in the CIA turned to their organized crime assets and said, we have a problem that we need you to solve. And the organized crime people turned to Jack Ruby, a guy who liked to hang out with the big boys in organized crime. And they said, Jack, do us a favor. And Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner, couldn't say no. And so he went and killed Oswald. So that's we know what happened. And the way I described it, I think, is the most likely scenario. Now, do I have smoking gun proof beyond a reasonable doubt that, any one individual participated in these events? No, I do not. These were very skillful covert operators, and they knew how to keep their fingerprints off of things. They knew how to proceed by indirection, and they had tremendous powers of official secrecy. So, and so people say, oh, you think it was the CIA did it? I think CIA personnel were involved, but it might have been a military intelligence operation, and CIA people only played a supporting role. We don't have enough specificity to point to individuals. There's a group of people, we can say those are the likeliest suspects. Those are people who participated in assassination operations. Those are people who knew about Oswald. Those are people who implicated themselves in the assassination. So, there's a group of plausible suspects in the CIA, but, I wouldn't name any of them in an article and say they did it, because the evidence isn't there. But collectively, the assassination emanated from the president's enemies in the military and intelligence agencies, I believe.
I have to tell you, everything I hear, and so I do this thing where I take all the information, I put it into my imagination, and I have like the engine of my computer, my brain, start running it. And so now I have the impression that the orchestrator, the architect behind all of this, compartmentalized it to different groups. It's really intelligent if you think about it, because at the end of the day, why did Oswald leave the evidence behind? That's the part that always bothered me my whole life. Why did he leave that rifle behind, knowing full well that would be used as evidence? Obviously you got to get out of there in a hurry, but you could have removed it from that place and probably tried to hide it better or something. And you're right. He went and got a pistol, which tells me something didn't go to plan, and he recognized it right away. He's like, "There's a problem here. I now know I'm going to be subject to problems.
I need to defend myself."
Right. So
something's happened where I have to defend myself.
Right, because the plan he knows didn't play out that way. He was there for whatever purpose his reason in being there was. He was there, but something happened, and he's like, "Wow, I'm in trouble. I got to go."
Right.
And this is why, with a very clean, plain state, he stated, "I'm a patsy in all this." And when you look at Jack Ruby and you examine him, and just as you said it, he really the word no cannot exist for him in that scenario. So I think whoever orchestrated this, they compartmentalized to different groups, different people. So at the end of the day, no one would really know the truth. It would be, it's impossible to decipher because no one really knew the full facts. It's like maybe what we said in the beginning of this, like there are a lot of information in higher intelligence agencies, even with the investigation of JFK, a lot of information wasn't shared, so that one group knew more than the other group or knew different things than the other group. So at the end of the day, I really believe no one really knows the facts. It would be impossible.
I disagree. I think we have a lot of facts, and I think we have a pretty good understanding. We don't have the specificity about individual perpetrators,
right?
And we can't know every detail. But the causal forces that led to the assassination of the president, I think we've got a pretty good fact pattern.
Right. Yeah. As far as that, yeah, absolutely. I'm speaking about who the main orchestrator. Someone had to put the plan together. In other words, there was a coach for that football team. Who's the coach?
Right. Yes, that's the part we don't know.
Right, and I don't know that we ever will, because the coach for that particular team is either no longer with us, and I think about this often. Why is there still information that's not being released to us? I don't think all parties are deceased. I mean,
that's true.
Yeah, or maybe there's a purpose that not only do all parties need to be deceased, but there's this allotment of time for even relatives not to be directly affected. I mean, it's not certain, but that's what I speculate anyway.
Right.
So real quick before we close out, tell her about your blogs again, your books, where they can find them, and I'll put all of it in description as well.
Yeah. So I'm Jeff Morley. I'm the editor of the JFK Facts blog, which you can find at jfkfacts.substack.com. And this is a newsletter about all things JFK. So go there, take a look. You can get some of the content for free. You can subscribe for a nominal $5 a month, and I guarantee you'll be interested. My books, Scorpion's Dance, the story of the CIA and Watergate, basically, came out in 2022, published by St. Martin's Press. You can get that on Amazon. The Ghost, the story of James Jesus Angleton, the counterintelligence chief of the CIA, also published by St. Martin's Press. You can get that on Amazon. And Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott, the CIA's top man in Mexico. That's available on the University Press of Kansas website. So those are my CIA books, and JFK Facts is my kind of outlet for daily journalism. Yeah, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jefferson Morley. So that's the way you can get in touch with me. People got questions, I'm always available to talk about this. So drop me a line.
Excellent. So for those of you that are listening, we're going to say good day, good evening, or whatever it is for you, and I'm going to talk to Jeff in post.